Welcome to our audience to the getAbstract expert webinar, Don't Just Survive, Thrive. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to talk to Michelle Holliday. She is a visionary author, facilitator, consultant, and for the past 2 decades, she has been consulting companies around the world. So her work centers around thrivability, a very great word. And thrivability basically is a set of perspectives and practices which are based on an understanding of organizations as dynamic living systems. So on this foundation, she accompanies organizations through change, designs and facilitates strategic gatherings, and delivers talks and workshops. She works across multiple sectors to enable the transition to a more regenerative, life-aligned work. Welcome, Michelle. It's very nice to have you here today.
Thank you, Ramona. It's so good to be with you.
Thank you. So many people agree that with the speed of change these days, businesses need to stay agile to survive. In your book, The Age of Thrivability, you say businesses must basically look beyond survival to thrivability. Can you describe a little bit what you mean by the term thrivability?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the great question. So at a basic level, the word means the ability to thrive, thrivability, right? And the way I bring it into my work is, and the way I define it in my work is as the informed intention and practice of enabling life to thrive. And enabling life to thrive at every level within and around the organization, for the people working within the organization, for the organization itself as a dynamic living ecosystem, for customers, for community, and the biosphere. So we start with being informed, because if we are to enable life to thrive and create the fertile conditions for life to thrive at all of those levels, then we need to be informed. We need to know, what does that take? What does that require of us? What does that look like? So that's the starting point of my work, offering what I think of as life's universal design principles. So this is the fertile conditions we find in any living system, anywhere there's life. Not yet, hold on. We're not ready for this slide quite yet. Thank you. So I describe those in my work and invite people into the practice of cultivating those. So the starting point is getting informed. And then the next step is setting that as our clear and explicit intention, the informed intention and practice. I find that in our organizations, in our society right now, we set our sights on something far less than life thriving, right? Things like productivity and profitability and efficiency, which are fine goals, but when that's the limit of our intention, then what we're discovering is that what we get is something catastrophically less than life thriving, right? And so it's vitally important that we get clear and explicit, whatever our industry, whatever our role, that the purpose of our work, the ultimate purpose, is to enable life to thrive. So informed intention and then practice. The final piece is to recognize that this is not a marketing campaign. This is not a new management fad. Thrivability, this is an ongoing individual and collective practice. And really, it's a life practice of stewarding, of tending to those fertile conditions in our organizations, in our communities, in order to enable life to thrive.
I think it's great. It's very promising. Yeah. So Michelle, I want to quote from a prior meeting that you and I had when you mentioned to me that companies are living systems. You just said it. So you said cultivate the right conditions for growth, and the whole will be more capable than the sum of the parts. Do you want to, for our audience, elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. So once we explore the idea that an organization is a living system, it's important to recognize that this is a radical proposition. I don't know if it strikes you as that, but we've all been raised in a worldview, a guiding story that tells us that everything in the world, especially our businesses, operates like a machine. And in that story, we are separate from each other, separate from our organizations, separate from nature. In that story, we exist to compete and consume, and productivity and profitability are the only things that matter. Scale and efficiency are the best ways to get there. So in that story, there's no place for life, and thriving is not a reasonable goal. It's not a reasonable intention. Output and productivity and profitability are the extent of what we would expect from a machine. And that story shapes every aspect of our lives. So it's sort of radical to embrace a larger story that says there are mechanistic aspects. So that story isn't all wrong. We don't have to leave everything behind, but there's more to the story. There has to be more to the story if we're to get beyond the harmful patterns. And if we're going to pull away from this cliff's edge where we find ourselves, right, as a species, as a civilization. So once we recognize that organizations are living systems, that there's more to the story, then we can dig into those universal design principles, the fertile conditions that we have to cultivate if we're going to enable life to thrive. So I'll give the word in just a second, but there are just 4 things that we need to know. These are our design principles, things to cultivate, and they really represent design conversations. So let's have a look at them all at once, and I'll take you through them quickly and then give a very simple example that we've all experienced.
Yes.
So let's show the slide. All right, here they are all at once. This is what we need to know about thriving living systems. In any thriving living system, there are diverse parts, right? So this is species in a rainforest and people in an organization, and the more diverse the contributions of the parts, the more resilient and adaptive and creative the living system is likely to be. And we know this. We know this from biodiversity. We know this from organizational theory. Those parts are supported and connected in patterns and structures of relationship and flow. And the more open and free-flowing those relationships can be, the more resilient and adaptive and creative, the more thrivable the organization and its ecosystem is likely to be. Those parts are supported and connected in relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole, a new level of life with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And this is what I was talking about in our earlier conversation. This is where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and new things become possible. And that's the magic we're after when we come together in organizations, that more becomes possible, right? And in human contexts, in human communities, what enables the emergence of new capabilities and characteristics so that the whole of us is greater than the sum of its parts is shared purpose, or shared story, shared identity. And the more compelling that shared purpose, the more life there will be, the more thrivable, the more resilient and adaptive and creative. And what powers that whole process, what enables the magic, the emergence of new possibility, is life. It's whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive. Any thriving living system is inherently self-organizing, self-generating, self-regenerating, or self-healing, integrating parts into wholeness because it is alive. And we don't have to know what that is or where it comes from. We don't have to have that conversation, but we do have to acknowledge that there is life in our organizations, in us, in the system that we create together. Otherwise, we get stuck in that mechanistic story where we see ourselves as mechanics and engineers commanding and controlling everything. And we're seeing what trouble that's getting us into. We're seeing that story has reached the limits of its effectiveness. So when we instead embrace life and the role of life, we see ourselves instead as stewards and gardeners in that individual and collective practice of tending to these other fertile conditions in partnership with life, in alignment with life.
Very well explained. Thank you. I love the imagery and I love the whole storytelling around it. Very nice.
And actually, do you mind if I share a simple example of this?
Please go ahead.
Okay,
Sure.
maybe that'll help even. So I hope all of us have had the experience of a really inspired conversation. And if you and I were in a maybe more natural conversation, Ramona, then if each of us could bring our diverse contributions. I'm sort of doing more than my fair share of talking in this conversation, but if you could talk more and we had different ideas to contribute as diverse parts, then that would create a certain level of thrivability in our conversation, in the living system that we would form together. And if we spoke the same language, we could understand each other. If our internet connection was good enough, if we had a level of trust and some protocols of taking turns, these are things we can design for to support flow of life and information sharing and decision making. And if we came together in wholeness around a topic that was really important to us and maybe to the world, a really compelling shared purpose, a shared inquiry, then we would bring even more life and aliveness. We would experience even more thrivability. And then if neither of us tried to choreograph or control the conversation too much, if we allowed ourselves to follow inspiration, then we would come up with ideas that neither of us arrived to the conversation with. New things would become possible, right? We would generate new ideas, and even we would surprise ourselves with our own brilliance. I hope you've had this experience where you say something in a moment of inspiration and you think, wow, that was good. Where did I come up with that? You know?
Yeah.
And we would feel more alive. We would feel nourished and enlivened. So that's what we're after. We want to design for that. That's being in partnership with life, right?
Yeah, wonderful. I really hope that we will have more conversations of that kind. As you were just mentioning it, I want to include our audience in this conversation as far as possible. Dear audience, if you have a question to Michelle, if you want to respond to the things she is saying, please contribute in our chat. So at any time you have the possibility to write down your questions or feedback in the chat, and we will try to address it. So Michelle, most of us work for a department and continue to think in terms of like achieving particular goals, as you mentioned before, profit and stuff, which without much consideration of what's best for the organization as a whole. As an employee, if I want to adapt more to that living systems approach at my workplace, how should I personally go about that? What can I do?
Mm-hmm. The most powerful and effective way to shift from that mechanistic story into a more life-aligned story is not alone, is to join with others, is to have to enter into the collective practice of tending to these fertile conditions. But it can be a one-person conversation. You can explore, what will it look like when I am able to bring my best gifts and contributions and to be nourished in the process, and what could support that? You can explore that for yourself, and you can reach out to find resources as a diverse part. And what will it look like when our interactions, when my interactions with others are characterized by flow and play and ease and creativity? And there are so many new methods that are emerging. I think you mentioned agile, needing to be more agile. So that's a set of methods that is in more alignment with life than more static and control-oriented methods that support self-organization. So you can enter into that exploration for yourself. As you imagine shared purpose, you sort of need to come together with some others, but you can have a one-person conversation about how you can contribute to more of what the world needs, and explore your practice of stewardship. It might be more helpful if I share what that looks like at a collective level as well, so that each person knows this is what I might join with others to do. So if we look at the next slide, my other slide, this is the sort of journey that an organization, that I guide organizations through. The first is exploring this new worldview, this new guiding story, the new perspective that the mechanistic story is too small, has reached the limit of its effectiveness. There's another story that's emerging in every sector of society. And that's the transition that I describe in my book, the transition into this new, more life-aligned worldview, and the implications of it for our organizations. So from there, we can explore, what does that mean for us? What mindset do we need to adopt if we are to show up as stewards and tending to those fertile conditions? It's a different role for ourselves, and different different ways of showing up, then we can reach out together to find new methods. And there are so many, like Agile, like sociocracy and holacracy, that many here may have heard of, but so many new ways of engaging with each other in more self-organization, in more creativity, and more effective collaboration. And then we'll be equipped with this new worldview, this expanded worldview, with a stance of stewardship, with more creative methods of being in conversation and decision making and information sharing. Then we're equipped to sense what is calling to us, calling us into wholeness, what compelling purpose that we may not have seen before, but that the world really needs of us. And now maybe we are equipped with more courage to move in that direction together, to contribute more as a whole together. And then we can move safely into individual actions as diverse parts in safe to fail experiments, good enough for now, safe to try, and safe enough to fail experiments. And finally, we can have conversations about not only how will we measure it, which is the mechanistic story's kind of favorite question, but how will we know? How will we know that we are more thrivable, that we are contributing to more thrivability for ourselves, for each other, for our living organization, for customers, for community and biosphere? So this is the bigger answer to how. How do we move into this? And we can, as individuals, it's much more powerful if we do it together.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here in the chat, somebody is asking about the benefits of this whole approach. How does it help us reach our personal and professional objectives more efficiently?
How does it help us reach our personal and professional goals more efficiently? So I have kind of two levels of answer for that. One is that if we go back to those universal design principles, if each of us is able to show up with more of our gifts and contributions and nourished in the process, then we're more able, more likely to achieve our objectives, right? If we can show up with more of what we have to offer. If our interactions are designed intentionally for flow and for creativity and innovation and responsiveness to changing circumstances, then we're more likely and we're more equipped to achieve our objectives, even in complexity, even in change. If our shared purpose is more compelling, then we'll bring more energy, we'll attract more resources, right? That's a consistent feature of my work in client organizations, that other people are drawn to organizations that are committed to this journey of thrivability. And if we align ourselves with life in this practice of stewardship, of deepening in wisdom and compassion and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action, there's this paradox that even though we let go of some of our control and we let go of wanting to be very efficient, efficiency is in some ways a mechanistic expectation, that it should take the least amount of time and effort and money possible for the greatest output. And so we try to control for that. The living system story tells us that's not the most important goal, and we have to be cautious to consider at what cost we gain efficiency. So the paradox is, as we sort of let go of our grip on efficiency, we actually achieve more efficient outcomes. There's more ease and more flow and less effort and less resource that's needed as we become more in alignment with life. That's my long answer to that.
I very much like that notion of shared purpose. I'm wondering, how can companies create those fertile conditions? How do you achieve a culture where shared purpose is a thing? How do you involve people and bring them together?
The basic answer to that is we bring them together in conversation about shared purpose. We really need to have that conversation, and not only among ourselves, but with stakeholders. So I'm part of a global community of practice called the Art of Hosting. The long name for it is the Art of Hosting conversations about things that matter and that lead to lasting change So it's really that. How can we come together in meaningful conversation about who we are and what the world needs, and how we can respond to that in ways that are also nourishing to us. And then we design the patterns of interaction to bring those together.
Okay. And on the individual level, how would employees at any level contribute to creating these conditions?
Mm-hmm. I think it really comes back to those conversations again. And if you are somehow not able to engage your peers, your colleagues in these conversations about what could it look like, what more is possible in how each of us shows up, and what more is possible in how we engage with each other, and what could support that. If you're really not able to have that conversation, have it on your own and experiment. There's so many resources available for learning and developing our practice of stewardship and stewarding each of those fertile conditions. And I also would sort of question, if you really can't talk to anybody, then it's not likely to be an organization that will support thrivability. This is a conversation we need to be having. And I wanted to kind of point to this, the phrase that we've been playing with, going beyond surviving to thriving, or to thrivability. And it's not a spectrum in which, if you're struggling to survive, then thriving is just not on your radar right now. You know, we'll get to that, but that's an eventual utopia. When we're talking about thrivability, cultivating the ability for life to thrive, I don't believe that an organization today can survive without tending to these conditions of thrivability. And I also believe that as a species, I'm not sure that we can survive unless we tend to these fertile conditions for life to be able to thrive at all of those levels.
Yeah. And what's your feeling? How are companies doing? How are people doing in that context? Do you think there is like the mindset? Do you see a shift? Like, I mean, taking into consideration all the things that are going on worldwide, do you see a shift towards a better future, a more fertile handling of things?
I do. I'm so encouraged, even as I'm discouraged by many things. But I did my initial research more than 20 years ago to discover these universal design principles and develop this approach. I've been working with it all this time, and it was very difficult for 10 years. It was really, really challenging to have this conversation in a business context. And I would say there was not much interest. And that started to shift to the point that I could write my book, The Age of Thrivability, that points to signs that that shift is happening across sectors, across spheres of society. And then in the last 2 years, it's like that hockey stick, diagram, where this conversation is almost mainstream. I'm finding so much readiness, so much openness, and also the convergence of methods that support it. So we're ready, and the resources that we need to support us in this transition are available. So it's a really fertile moment for humanity, and the urgency is there like never before. So it's a good combination for making the change, and it's not guaranteed that we'll make it.
But I'm glad that it's encouraging that you at least see the shift, that something is going on. There is a question in the chat, which I think is relating back to something you said before. The question is, why is productivity per se not always the best yardstick for measuring success?
Well, I think we're seeing that just producing more and more stuff is getting us in trouble, right? We have pollution, we have excess. If we don't pay attention to why we produce things, what we produce, how we produce, then we're not going to make it. We're really just at that cliff's edge. So it's vitally important to start with the wisdom and healing that are needed, and these are really provocative words, really kind of radical. Again, I was on a webinar like this, but with another speaker recently, and he is a coach to Fortune 500 CEOs. He's published in the Harvard Business Review very frequently. And I asked him, are you able to talk with your clients about wisdom and healing? What is the wisdom and healing that are needed? And he said, oh, no, no, those are too maybe touchy-feely, kind of HR-ish. These were his words, kind of maybe coachy, something like that. And that terrified me. I thought, if we can't ask ourselves, what is the wisdom that's needed? And you may have seen this word regeneration, regenerative agriculture, regenerative tourism, regenerative economics. That's a wonderful term that I use, and it's becoming more and more prominent. It's a synonym for healing. There's so much healing that's needed. So if that isn't our intention to contribute to the wisdom and healing that are needed, then that scares me. I think we need to be able to have that conversation, and then from there choose what will we produce and how, to what end.
Okay. There's another super interesting question. It's about habits. Does thriving need to become a habit? I find that very interesting.
Yeah. I differentiate between this practice of thrivability and thriving. So I think the practice of thrivability, of tuning into where there is more aliveness and flow and where there are blockages, the practice of stewardship and tending to those fertile conditions, I think that's the habit that's needed. It feels a little bit like thriving is the outcome and the practices are the habit. And it's interesting, even in dying, we can be thriving if we're tending to these conditions, So there are so many paradoxes in living systems. But yeah, I think my answer would be yes, we need habits. It's this habit of tuning in and tending more than the thriving itself.
Okay. A second part to the question would be if you think that would lead to competition in the short term, if people made a habit out of what you just said.
All of that. Yeah. Well, maybe so. And to some degree, competition is part of life. I think we can deepen our understanding of the word competition. The root of it, the etymology of the word, means striving together. So trying to become better, trying to thrive, but together. So in sports, you want a good competitor because it helps you get better. So competition is not a bad thing. When we want to kill our competition, maybe that takes us into the mechanistic story. But if we can challenge each other, it sounds like maybe the question is asking about internal competition within an organization. I'm not sure. But I haven't seen that certainly as a problem, that when we aim for thriving and engage in the practice of thrivability, I've seen that it brings people together even across difference. It makes our goal something transcendent. We're aiming for something bigger than both of us. So let's set aside our differences, even if we are competitors within a sector. In fact, I work with farmers who are moving into the regenerative methods of agriculture, and I asked them, isn't there competition among you? And they laughed and laughed. They said, oh, that's cute. People always ask us that, but it's just not how life works. We need each other. We need to learn together, and that's more important. And life
That's
is
a
more
good point.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I just
No,
want to say that's a really good point, that we
exactly.
need competition, that we need to learn from each other. It's a very good point. Yeah.
Both can coexist. They are technically in competition with each other, and there's more to the story. Both can be true.
Okay. Here's a question which probably goes in the direction of company culture. So you said before that, like, when you don't find a person within your company, within your team to talk about thrivability, then you're probably not in a company which has that kind of mindset. And the question from the person is, how do you thrive with incentive-based team members?
The incentive-based approach to work is generally quite mechanistic, sort of, if you push this button, you get this outcome. So to get to more thrivable outcomes, to get to that place where new things become possible, I find it a more effective approach to we don't necessarily have to abandon that kind of feedback and sharing of rewards and of the outcomes of our efforts that incentives can represent. But if that's the primary focus of our collaboration, of our contributions, it's very vulnerable, because some other company could offer a little bit more, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that's all you've got going to keep people there, and if you have this mindset that says I have to motivate them, which is a term from physics, not living systems, I have to push them somehow, right? Then it's vulnerable, and it's not really aligning with all that life has available to it. And so the things I'm describing are more defensible, sort of. They are more likely to be unique to your organization, in part because the people involved are co-creating through these design conversations. And so it is not just a thing that I'm doing, it is part of who I am at this moment, and it's meaningful to me. So how you deal with someone who's incentive based, I'm not so sure. That's a bigger conversation, but I would encourage companies to look beyond that as their main source of getting things done.
Yeah, and I guess if we flip that around, if you're a person who's only looking for incentives, then you might lack purpose and a goal
Right.
in
Yeah,
your
and
professional
so
life.
many of us do. It hasn't been an option. It hasn't been available, and it's deadening. It leaves us feeling less alive, and it contributes to toxic workplaces where someone's job is to manipulate someone else as if they are a part in a machine, and that's not how life works. It's diminishing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So maybe
Let's
some soul
maybe,
searching is needed. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Let's maybe talk a bit about patterns and about flows. So in your book, you continually stress that there are divergent parts within humans. And that's what makes the organization a living organization. That is the people in it, as you pointed out before. And many organizations, they keep sticking to very outdated processes and rules. And many employees in that way are stuck in work routines, which they find hard to break. And then in that sense, their daily lives, their professional lives are just not flowing the way they should.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have advice for people how to break these old patterns?
Mm-hmm. I think it comes down to someone having courage. Someone
Mm-hmm.
having courage to have these conversations, to invite someone else into this conversation, one of these design conversations about what it could look like if we could show up, each of us as diverse parts, with more of what makes us alive, and to be more nourished in the process, and what could support that. And these are bold, courageous conversations. And what could it look like if our work didn't feel bad, but there was flow and playfulness, and what could support that? And there are answers available, and there's so many answers available right now, like agile, like I'm also part of a community of practice called applied improvisation. So it's bringing playful methods from theatrical improvisation into meetings to serve our strategic purposes. So there are lots and lots of easily accessible things that are safe to try, that bring more life and help us open up to the idea that more is possible. There are different ways. And then the last two design conversations get bigger and trickier, but we can work our way up to them by having more lively meetings. And then within that capability of more lively meetings, maybe we can have conversations about, what is this really about? What are we really yearning for to contribute to the world? What are we noticing in the world? What do we think is actually needed if we are to be the change that the world needs us to be? That's a bigger conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it takes courage.
Yeah, I can imagine that you had many of those conversations which take courage throughout your career. Do you want to share one, a personal one, which I can imagine could be very inspirational for many of us who are
Mm,
trying to change things?
sure, yes. So one that I tell often is working with a coalition of nature museums in Montreal, a biodome, which is several ecosystems recreated under one roof. So you walk in and you're in the tropical rainforest and so on. A planetarium, a botanical gardens, and an insectarium. And they were 4 separate entities, all owned by the city of Montreal. And the mayor at one point merged them administratively and called them the Montreal Nature Museums. And it was partly to save money. We could fire some HR and finance people, why have 4 when you could just have one of each of those, but partly to put Montreal on the map more fully and create one brand that could represent all of them. But the employees were not at all interested in being one brand. They had different histories, different scientific disciplines, different, one was in a different location. So my colleague and I brought all 650 people together for a day to explore, to have these design conversations. And we came back with a draft manifesto and asked them, is this what you said? Does this feel authentic? And what's fascinating is that these nature scientists, the directors of the 4 institutions and the one director who was appointed to oversee all of them, their first feedback was, it's really good, we like it, but there's one problem. You used the word life, and we don't talk about life, we talk about nature, because we're scientists and nature is there and we can measure it and touch it, but life is amorphous and intangible and it might be spiritual, so can you take that out? So my colleague and I, and actually the director of the 4, said, this is important. There's something here. This is going to take courage, but if you can't talk about life and you're a biologist, then who can? And maybe there's a connection between our inability to talk about life and our decreasing ability to sustain life on the planet. Maybe this is the conversation that you need to have with the world. And so they were courageous and they did what I think of as 6 months of soul searching, collective soul searching. And in the end, they came up with a new identity for themselves that they will tell you is not a brand, it's a conversation and a commitment, a movement. So now together they're called Espace pour la Vie, which means a space for life. And they kept their individual identities as well. All kinds of wonderful, amazing transformation. The punchline that maybe most people would be interested in is that they struggled to raise enough money over 7 years. They tried and tried to raise enough money to renovate the planetarium that was in a different part of town and it was run down, and they never could. And within 1 year of this process and announcing their manifesto to the city, they were able to raise $190 million and build a new planetarium on the same site as the others and do 5 other capital improvement projects. So it's
It's
magnetic.
amazing.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
powerful. Wow. Yeah, but I get that that was very challenging, like bringing together all those people and
Right.
yeah, to
And can we
just
go there?
invest.
They had to ask themselves, as scientists, can we talk not only about nature, but can we talk about life? And then can we be transparent and can we collaborate across institutions and can we shift our governance structure? There were other implications that called for courage.
Yeah. Speaking of life, here's another question from the chat, which is actually about death. It says in your book, you mentioned that death is part of all natural processes and that it has its place in thrivability. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Mm-hmm. In the mechanistic story, death is failure. When something doesn't work, when something ends, that means the machine is broken and we just stop there and blame, and there's no learning, there's no continuity. But in life, there's compost. There's always something that's enriching, and we can enter into our projects with that recognition so that even as we end projects for any reason, we can do it with grace, really, with an attention to the relationships and the learning so that the soil of our of our relationships, of our community, is enriched by the process. If we go in with that intention of care and wisdom, then even death of a project or of a person, we find that part of this shift away from the mechanistic story to a living system story shows up in actual death. In society right now, as we die, our bodies are put into processing mechanisms. It's very sterile and separate from us, but now there's a whole movement of hospicing and recognizing it as a natural part of life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is really deep.
It is.
Honestly, very, very big conversation, very deep topic. Maybe in that context, what are very crucial conversations that you think we need to have with each other in order to find new ways forward?
I keep coming back to those 4 universal design principles and the design conversations that go with them. I think those are the crucial conversations. And I actually, it's easiest to explain them starting with the parts and then connecting the parts in relationship and building up to a whole. And then we imagine ourselves as stewards. But it's actually more powerful if we start in the other order, if we dig into what does it mean not to be in full control, and where are we already doing that in our parenting, in our care for plants or gardens, and what is that experience like for us? This is a powerful conversation that I often host groups in. We know how to do this, and so can we give ourselves permission to show up in that way also in our organizations, recognizing that there are some things that will need to be managed and controlled. If the copier is broken, we're going to fix that thing, but if we need to sense the wisdom and healing that are needed, or tend to our ways of working together, that's a different stance, a different way of showing up. So I think that's the most crucial conversation. What does it mean for us to show up in the world in a different way, and what's really called for? What if we're honest? I wrote an article recently for the tourism industry. I do a lot of work in tourism, and there's this transition is happening in tourism in a really fascinating way. And what I said was, the situation humanity faces is so dire, if we're honest, if we really pay attention, that we need every industry, every sector to lay down their tools for a moment, look up and around at the world and say, how can we help? So can you have that conversation? That's a crucial conversation. And then from there, let's design for that. Let's design for the interactions that are going to help us get there. Let's design for each of us to show up, and let's figure out how will we know that we're moving in that direction towards more and more thrivability.
Michelle, I'm honestly glad that there are people like you who are starting the conversation, who are enabling and also fostering conversation, because it's a very, very important topic. Well, we are already at the end of our conversation. It's unbelievable. Time flew by so fast. It was really super great having you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting these calls. I think this is such a valuable service, and I love getAbstract. And I'm not just plugging that, but I'm truly grateful that you make information easily accessible, important information available.
Thank you so much. And also thanks to our audience who joined today, and to the ones who participated with their questions. I see many, many more, which we unfortunately couldn't address. But here in a moment, you see also Michelle's contact. Michelle at michelleholliday.com, and also there is the contact to getAbstract, corporate@getAbstract.com. So if you do have a question, please feel free to contact Michelle or us. We are happy to make the connection. And for more relevant content on today's topic, check out the channels like sustainability, management concepts, even mindfulness. There's a lot of great content out there on the topic of thriving. And you will also receive the recording of the session in the next couple of days. So I'm wishing you all a great day, a great rest of the week, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing you again soon. Goodbye. Thank you very much. Goodbye, Michelle.
Bye.